My name is Robin Diangelo. I'm an associate professor of education at Westfield State University in Massachusetts. My scholarly interests are in the field of what's called whiteness studies, and that is looking at what it means to be white. It's looking at the larger context that we all are immersed in, concepts such as white supremacy, racism, privilege. So I focus on race with a really particular emphasis on whiteness within this construct of race and racism. And I'm particularly concerned about an increasingly white teacher education force or teaching force and an increasingly racially diverse student population. Well, there are two really key areas that I think of with that question. And one is institutions. So law is inherently an institution. It's one of many, but all institutions are kind of integrated and cross over and support each other. So essentially an institution makes and enforces society's rules, ideologies, practices, policies. I'm in education, which is a primary site of socialization, and I would say a primary site of the reproduction of social inequality. And law is another institution which, of course, intersects with education. Definitely my work takes up issues of justice and in both subtle and not subtle, explicit and implicit. For many people, and certainly my students, it's really easy to see kind of traditional explicit practices of inequality, but it's very difficult to see what it looks like today. For example, day in and day out, I'm in rooms that are upwards of 97% white. In fact, it is rare for me to ever have a student of color. And my students live, love, learn, study, worship, live, play, die in racial segregation. And no one who's ever mentored them or guided them or taught them has ever conveyed to them that there was any loss to them in that segregation. That is a powerful and really profound way that inequality is operating every moment of our lives. But it's a really difficult one to kind of wrap your head around. One, because again, we think about oppression or inequality or racism as these explicit acts that people intend to do, and they're mean-spirited, and those people are bad, and we're not bad, so it couldn't be us. There are many ways in which we've rationalized and justified that segregation. So you're up against some, pretty deep cultural conditioning and socialization. As far as the law goes, what comes to mind for me is what we term the school-to-prison pipeline, the really concrete outcome of many aspects that come together in education. So there's that primarily white teaching force that has grown up in segregation, that don't have authentic cross-racial relationships, who have not been taught by teachers of color, who have therefore got their information about people of color from really problematic sources, stories, jokes, media, MSNBC lockup, Jerry Springer, right? I mean, just really, really problematic, really narrow understandings. But that population is in the position to essentially socialize everyone's children. They get to determine who's smart, who's not, who's respectful, who's not, who speaks right, who doesn't, who belongs to special education, and who doesn't, who should be punished in what ways. And then you have the curriculum, which of course is very Eurocentric. You have laws and policies that schools operate under that of course are not neutral. You have school boards that decide what will be studied. So you have many, many threads of the institution that are in schools and then cause the reproduction of racial inequality. So you have a disproportionate, and it's well documented now. I teach in the States, and so I couldn't say directly what that might look like specifically in Canadian society, although I can assure you that it exists. It just the history may be different, and the particular groups may be different. You have a really, really painful, long history of inequality towards Aboriginal people, where we would tend to kind of the ultimate racial other for white Americans, I believe, is African Americans, and yet I would assume you still have that disparity in outcomes, in achievement, in testing, in teacher assumptions of capabilities, in intelligence, in punishment, in dropout rates, and in every measure by race you can empirically track those inequitable outcomes. And so that will tend to push students of color into the juvenile justice system. Once they're in the juvenile justice system, they're more likely to be in that loop that continues them on. So the school to prison pipeline is meant to capture this dynamic that pretty effectively and easy to measure tracks students of color and low-income students into the criminal justice system. And so people see it as almost just like a really smooth pipeline. So teachers tend to expect more from Asian heritage students and less from Black and Latino students. And of course, we might want to say that those expectations of more are positive. They're still really problematic. They still set up Black and Latino students, and in your case, probably Aboriginal students, as, these are the good ones. Why can't you be like these ones? These ones show there is no problem. And then, of course, it lumps all Asian heritage students together, regardless of their histories, their immigration status, how they got here, their class background, their language, the challenges that they face, and they are also more likely to fall through the cracks. There is no human functioning outside of laws. Laws are essentially the social contract. They define the parameters of our lives, whether they be the unspoken rules and norms of that we get socially that teach us how to behave correctly and what's normal, and then really concrete laws, like literally laws, policies, practices. So there is no space outside of law, and because of that, they have a profound impact on what happens in society. Laws have always been the site of great, great struggle because they can either uphold or enforce inequality, or they can help to ameliorate or remedy inequality. And because laws come out of the institution, and institutions are controlled by dominant groups, and I will just say it, they tend to be controlled by middle to upper class, white and male, across the board. They will necessarily reflect the interest perspectives of that privileged class. They're not going to represent people who are not at the table. And many of the structures of society guarantee that we can predict who will be at the table and who won't be at the table. And as Frederick Douglass said so powerfully so many years ago, power concedes nothing without a struggle. It never has and it never will. If you just passively see law as not your concern, and you naively assume that the laws are going to look out for your best interest, you're going to guarantee the reproduction of inequality. These laws won't look out for your best interest. And I'll give you an example from the States, which would be the law as colorblind. To not account for race and differences like that. And that sounds good on the surface, but in practice, it absolutely obscures racial inequality and racism. Another example is, well, you can't discriminate anymore racially, because that's what I'm focused on. But you also have to prove intentions. And I don't think most people understand that. You have to prove that the person intended to discriminate against you. Well, most discrimination is unintentional. It's unaware. It comes from the realm of implicit bias, which is also infused into laws. That's the first thing. If it depends on me being aware and intentional to discriminate, odds are that I'm never going to be able to see that. Two, if it depends on me admitting that I meant to do it, I'm not going to do that either, because that's a very bad thing, right? That would make me a bad person and a moral person. I am not going to admit that. So it looks like we have protections, but they were set up in ways that make it pretty much guaranteed you're not going to be able to do anything about racial inequality. And because the people making those adaptations over time, they didn't represent the perspectives of people of color who could kind of point those things out. They're going to serve the interests of those that created them. And there are deep investments in the status quo. So questions like kind of inherently multicultural questions or social justice questions, like who does this serve, right? Whose story is this? Who does this protect? Who does it actually protect? Mm-hmm. And from what? All of those things. And to be a citizen is to be engaged. And you can't be an engaged citizen if you can't ask those questions and if you don't see it as your place. There's a exercise I do with my students sometimes, and you give them the story. There's a princess, and she's in the castle, and her father goes away, and he says, absolutely, you cannot leave the castle while I'm gone, but she does, and she has to get across the water by the ferryman, and she bribes him, and then she gets to the other side, and she sees her friend, and then she's late getting back, and the person won't let her cross unless she does something or other, and she won't do it, so he actually kills her. So it's like I know it sounds horrible, but it's like a lot of fairy tales, right? Those kinds of those parables that are teaching you something. So you have all these players, right? And then you have kids discuss, so who's most wrong and who's least wrong. And everything comes out in that discussion. You can't believe how many students want to blame her, or they don't look at the structures to begin with. They don't look at the rules to begin with that cause her to have to do these things. So, and you surface the values that are associated with different roles, the inability to see the larger structures. They reveal so much in their discussions, plus they have a really invigorating discussion. And so I think you can get at the power of rules and laws and who they serve with analogies like that, and then exercises like that, and then them having to articulate and discover for themselves. And so we have a really timely issue, which is gay marriage, because it's not federally recognized. And so using that to track institutions, laws, ideology, religion, the medical institutions, all of the ways that institutions intersect to set this up. So this is actually something that we are debating at this time, and that it is not federally accessible across the U.S. So it's an example that is living in most of my students' lives. Well, actually in all of their lives, whether they're aware of it or not. Almost all of them have opinions and ideas about it, know people, or maybe themselves identify as gay or queer. So if you could take really current issues, because that's another challenge, is that the dominant ideology puts inequality in the past. And, we have a black president now, so we're post-racial, and, we have Oprah, and I'm not sure who you have, but in the States, or in Canada, but you really need to make it real for them and not allow them to distance themselves to the past. So, for example, we don't have residential schools anymore. But you have to help students trace that into the present, or they're going to disconnect themselves from it. Using the example of the Supreme Court in the United States, currently, almost right down the line, 5-4, 5-4, 5-4, almost every case is along ideological grounds. And so what you can help students see is that these are human beings. No human being is objective. They serve particular interests. They're not going to serve your interests if they don't know your interests. And almost any change that has been made for the greater good has come from great activism. It doesn't come just naturally out of people's good wills and good intentions, for all kinds of reasons that I like to help students study. That inequality is very difficult to see, particularly if you're kind of in the water of the group that benefits from it. Mm-hmm. It's very difficult to see. But I teach a class called Schools in Society, and that's a really great kind of macro analysis of how schools as an institution reproduce particular interests. And so you can look at the school board, how are textbooks chosen, how does the stories change when you get different voices in? And to me, all of that is connected to law, because ultimately human beings are making laws. A very small, very monocultural, for the most part, group is making laws that affect everybody's life. And the only way to get your voice and to be heard is to be at the table, and you're gonna have to push yourself into the table, because room is not gonna be made for you from goodwill alone. My favorite example to use to get my students to understand institutional power versus personal power, because there's a lot of emphasis on individuals and personal power and all of that. And institutional power is something very different. And I use women's suffrage in the US and ask, when did women get the right to vote? 1920 in the US. Who gave it to us? And is there any other way we could have gotten the right to vote except for men to give it to us, outside of a violent and bloody revolution, which I'm not advocating? There's literally no other way for them to give us the right to vote, because we weren't sitting in the institutional seats of power. And that's the difference. And between a woman's individual prejudice towards a man and actually having institutional power. And even those men who advocated for women, and of course there had to be some, or we wouldn't have gotten the right to vote, they still benefited from a system that excluded women. Right? And it didn't come because somebody knocked on the door and said this is the right thing to do. It was decades of struggle. population. Well, there are two really key areas that I think of with that question. And one is institutions. So law is inherently an institution. It's one of many, but all institutions are kind of into context that we all are immersed in. Concepts such as white supremacy, racism, privilege. So I focus on race with a really particular emphasis on whiteness within this construct of race and racism. And I'm particularly concerned about an increasingly white teacher education force or teaching force and an increasingly racially diverse student population. My name is Robin Diangelo. I'm an associate professor of education at Westfield State University in Massachusetts. My scholarly interests are in the field of what's called whiteness studies, and that is looking at what it means to be white. It's looking at the larger integrated and crossover and support each other. So essentially an institution makes and enforces society's rules, ideologies, practices, policies. I'm in education, which is a primary site of socialization, and I would say a primary site of the reproduction of social inequality. And law is another institution which of course intersects with education. Definitely my work takes up issues of justice and in both subtle and not subtle, explicit and implicit. For many people, and certainly my students, it's really easy to see kind of traditional explicit practices of inequality, but it's very difficult to see what it looks like today. For example, day in and day out, I'm in rooms that are upwards of 97% white. In fact, it is rare for me to ever have a student of color. And my students live, love, learn, study, worship, live, play, die in racial segregation. And no one who's ever mentored them or guided them or taught them has ever